So originally I was going to do this presentation as a security person, and then we have Brad, who is an egghead, an accountant, a business guy. So we went ahead and added him. And IRM does not mean incident response management. We found that out. So what the goals are today is to we want you to understand that there's a communication language between business people and what we do, right? And if we're not speaking the same language, then it's really hard for them to give you money, right? Or give you any kind of resources. The second thing we're going to talk about is bringing everybody into the project and into the world of security instead of alienating people and saying, no, you can't do this or no, you can't do that.
I think even naturally too, I think the business doesn't feel included. They don't feel like it's their responsibility or role, so they're just kind of hands-off approach and not really trying to be involved.
Yep. And then trying to provide metrics, and metrics in cybersecurity is difficult because there's a lot of ways to look at things. And then we'll also be talking about objectiveness. So in pathways to security, you basically, you have physical security people, you have technical security people, you have business security people. And when you come up in that direction, you actually get skewed on what you want to pay attention to. So I'm more likely to pay attention to technical risks and vulnerabilities.
Well, on the business side, right? I'm mostly concerned about incidents that really affect me. So I'm not worried about the details of vulnerabilities themselves. It's like if there's a significant incident to the company that's going to affect me, I want to know about that one.
Yep. So kind of knowing where that blind side is. The other thing is trying to figure out who's responsible for these things, right? So we have chief risk officers, chief information security officers, senior management, all the way down to contractors and employees. Everybody should be involved. The problem is if you're in a small company, you probably don't have a risk officer, right? You may not even have a CISO. You may just have senior management, executives, and contractors. But communicating, the jobs are still the same whether you're a small business or you're a large business, just the small business may not have the resources that the large does. So you still have to divvy those responsibilities up to somebody and making sure that they understand what their job and their role is.
So you think about these roles here. So chief risk officer, right? His role is to manage the risk of organization. Every company has risk. The best way to have no risk is to not do business, right? And that's not possible. So his job is to understand the risk holistically of the organization, the risk of the business side, the cyber side, everything, and manage that risk to acceptable thresholds, and inform senior management who has objectives how we're doing, and kind of manage and balance that risk versus aggressiveness of doing business. And so they're relying on the chief information security officer to give them that information, as well as people, the first line, people doing the actual work, to communicate with them as well. And so they definitely, all four are interrelated, have to work together to meet the business objectives and manage risk appropriately while still doing business.
Okay. So the first thing that we kind of bring up is culture of collaboration. And this is, like you were saying earlier, organizations are now bringing in, the business side to the conversation of risk because they have to, right? It's incredibly important, and it's one of those things that when we go to the organization as a cybersecurity person and say, you can't do this, you can't do this, we're shaming people on stuff. There was, I think you had an incident that kind of matches to this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been in consulting my entire career, except for the last 3 years. I was at a large financial institution. And so cyber they had a great awareness program, and they had a really strong phishing program. So, we'd get phishing emails all the time, and I became excellent at spotting a phishing email, right? But the problem was it was really aggressive. So if you, as a business person, if I fell for it and responded, the first time I get my hand slapped. Second time they'd notify my boss when he takes me training. The third time it was I lost access to my computer until I did training. It made it really onerous. And so from a business perspective, I appreciate the awareness, but it became really aggressive to the point where I didn't want to work with the cyber team, and if I had another problem outside of phishing, there was no way I was going to go talk to them because I was probably wrong. I'd probably get in trouble for even talking to them, right, or doing something. So that culture was, it wasn't inclusive, right? It was like I was almost afraid to talk to them because they were going to cause other issues for me as opposed to collaborating with me.
Yeah. And the other thing is people are always afraid to report up an event, right? So they see somebody strange in the hallway, they don't have a badge, but they don't say anything, right? They're scared. They're like, I don't want to, I don't want to get involved. I always say the easiest way to break into a building is carry a box, right? And somebody will open the door for you. So in the past, and I mean, this is just kind of the way I feel, is security was a fear-based, right? If you don't do this, somebody's going to hack in, and there's this bad guy hacker who's just going to kill us. And the problem with that is if it doesn't happen, then now it's like, well, I can get away with it, right? Optimistic bias kind of beats fear every time, right? So we know texting while driving is bad, we still do it, right? Because there's 1,000 times that we haven't been into a wreck. But then that one time you get into a wreck and kill somebody or kill yourself, then it's concerning, right? So the way to kind of help an organization to understand that is give them not a fear-based, but give them a business-based, right? So give them like, hey, if you don't do this, the potential risk is $500,000 loss in 2 days, right?
I think the key thing too is the news trends, right? So from the business perspective, if I don't have a partnership with my cyber team, they're not really telling what the real risks are, I'm hearing on the news, right? So ransomware, that's the obvious one. That's probably been beaten to death. We might do everything under our power to focus on ransomware and ignore data privacy or other things because we're listening to the news trends versus our internal cyber team because I don't really want to work with them to get that advice from them directly.
Yep. So the other thing is know your audience. And when you think of a C-level executive, so CFO, if you talk about the CFO of Coca-Cola, that dude's got like 35 years of experience for you. I mean, this guy's or gal has been through everything. They've done, they're a very high-level top executive. When you're a CISO, that's only been around since 1994. Some of us have kids older than that, right? So it's one of those things that the CISO is not, they don't have the key to the executive bathroom. They have the C in their title, but they don't have the authority or the power to do what they need to do sometimes. So in order to do that, you have to be communicating to the organization on their terms and the way that they speak.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I think we are seeing a trend, hopefully it continues, this you call little c versus big C for the CISO. It should be elevated for sure. Right. I think there's a growing awareness of how important it is for the CISO to actually be part of the leadership group versus informing leadership group.
Yeah, I have one customer who the CISO reports to a manager, who reports to a director, who reports to like a CIO, right? It's like so many levels down that his message never gets filtered up. And it's also he's reporting through IT, right? So now you're reporting through IT, trying to tell problems about IT. Oh yeah, that person's going to be more than happy to go talk to the board, right? And then I have another organization that I work with where the CISO reports only to the board and to the president of the company. They're a defense contractor, they understand it, right? So hopefully the industry will catch up. I mean, the federal government understands secrets and security a lot better than kind of the open market. And then the other thing is focusing on communicating and not fixing. Someone gave me really good advice. They said an employee was coming in late all the time, and instead of saying, well, have you set your alarm clock? Have you done this? Have you done this? Just say, well, what are you going to do to fix it? Right? So giving them solutions is not necessarily always an easy thing, but actually asking them what their solution should be, getting the advice from the organization. We all know Kevin O'Leary, Mr. Wonderful. If you've all seen Shark Tank, if they walk in and they go, what are your sales numbers? And they go, he attacks them, right? And he's somewhat right, because if you don't know the numbers behind what you're doing, and can't demonstrate that to the organization, what are you really doing as a CISO or as a security person?
I don't know if every October for a lot of companies it's budget season, right? And so the thing in the prior screen, what's commonly done is leaders of those organizations march into the conference room and say, here's my budget request for this year. CISO team wants, X number of dollars. That's exactly what happens. There's usually a Kevin O'Leary at the table who's often from accounting or CFO's office who's in charge of maintaining the budget. And exactly, it's like, okay, they're going to ask the same type of questions. How much does it cost? Why do we actually need it? What's the benefit? Why do I want to do this as a company? So if you can't communicate that, it's pretty easy. Everyone wants budget every year, right? But they get scrutinized pretty heavily, just like it would be on Shark Tank or some other situation like that where someone's giving you money. You really have to have those answers behind your request to justify it and back it up.
The other thing we're seeing in the industry is that it's no longer, security isn't necessarily a cost center, it can be a profit center. So if you go to your marketing group and say, look, if we stand up and we say, hey, we're secure, every TV commercial you see, Apple, everybody else is saying, security is most in forefront, right? So it can be a business driver that can actually help the organization. And like even in federal contracts, we've seen the point system, by being NIST compliant or CMMC compliant, those points on an RFP can go up. So therefore, it kind of helps to get funding that direction.
Well, in that last top there, you think about reputational risk. That's becoming more and more of a risk people think about based on cyber incidents, cyber crimes, right? And so having low reputational risk because you have a strong cyber program is definitely a selling point to investors and to clients of your organization.
And then on business impact analysis, bringing in tabletop exercises and bringing them into the thing, bringing them into the experience of understanding what that looks like is much more helpful than just telling them that this is what the risks are.
Yeah, so absolutely. So when you think about, you talk about risk, sometimes it's kind of nebulous. You think to the business, they kind of understand what they might be, and you ask them, so what's your risk of, if your process that you execute, say you're doing a financial process and I'm in charge of accounting, if your process goes down for a week and you can't use your accounting system, what's the impact to you? What's the risk? How's it going to affect you? They may think, I got my spreadsheets, I can do it offline or whatever. They give you a general response maybe, but when you actually make them do the exercise and actually simulate it happening and you walk them through the scenarios and you simulate to make it more realistic, right, as things change over time, it forces them to kind of live through it without actually having the pain and give you better information to help you quantify the results. So what is the actual risk to them if they lose access to their systems for a week or a month or whatever? They can now tell you because they've lived through it. And more importantly, since they've lived through it in a sense, they're more supportive of what you're trying to do. They actually realize the impact to them. They've had a scenario that kind of highlights what it's going to be, and they're going to be more supportive of what you're trying to do to help them.
So one of the best customers that I've ever had were customers who got breached, right? As soon as they get breached, there's no problem, right? They just throw the money at you. And then after that sting, it's the same. The safest place in America was New York City 9/12, right? If you left a package on the side of the road, somebody was going to call and get it taken care of, right? Because an incident happened. This is an easy way to get them to go through an incident without actually having to go through the incident.
And I think the last thing maybe on the bottom of that slide, you think about communicating the business, right? If everyone's heard of SWOT analysis, strengths, weakness, opportunities, threats, very common thing, right? And so if you can actually demonstrate what those are, and so you can communicate to the strengths, right? And so you kind of highlight what your weaknesses might be, working from home example, right? Or no remote access. Things that they can actually, you can quantify in one of those 4 buckets. You're suddenly speaking their language. It's not just statistics to them.
And you can also map that SWOT analysis over to a framework, right? So if you're using CISSP or you're using this, but by going through the framework that we understand and then putting it into key enablers, also kind of building a roadmap for what's going to come is important, right? So doing basically your strengths, your weaknesses, your average, your opportunities. It can, again, give them what we understand from the translation from, like a NIST framework over to what they understand, which is a roadmap of what needs to happen.
And I think the business, communicates in frameworks themselves, right? They may use a different type of framework, but they respect when you're talking to them in the lens of a framework, right? Has some credibility to you and your organization if you can demonstrate through a well-known framework how you're doing and pointing out your strengths and weaknesses. Yeah, that's what they're doing anyway. They're doing the same thing based on their framework. So it really, as you think about bringing risk holistically together across the company, this is a great way to give to your information, give your CRO, who's reporting on your behalf to the CEO, how we're doing with risk in our company.
And it's again important to have a roadmap. Because if you go to the table and you say, I need this much money, and then next week you go, I need this much money, and I swear to God, this is it, and then next week you go for more money, that lessens your credibility, right? So they had a budget in mind, you've kind of overshot it. So going through the math of this for us and really getting objective opinions, making sure that you talk to everybody about it is critically important.
And I think too, so you want a roadmap, right? So think about any project you've done in your life, right? You set up a project, you're going to execute that project, right? So we have a roadmap, we're going to do a roadmap. What if nobody's managing the project over time? What happens to the project? Just kind of, it fizzles out, right? It's the same concept here. So you talk about governance. Governance is kind of a nebulous term, but governance is that function that makes sure the project's being executed. It defines who's in charge, who the decision maker is, and more importantly, over time, it has processes built into it to manage change, right? So I built my roadmap at the beginning of the year, and my priorities might change unexpectedly. And so what's the process for absorbing that change and changing this roadmap in a way that makes sense for my company? And so that's where you have to have this governance strategy and processes and team in place to adjust your roadmap as necessary, but also keep you on track and make sure it's being executed.
And the governance can also look over everything instead of just the pieces that we understand. So, trash is not our business, right? Disposal of trash is not, we're not custodians. But when, something gets leaked in the trash and goes public and we get fired, we can say it's not our job all the time, but it's still our job, right? So having an overall understanding and also pointing out to the resources that it may be their job, what their tasks are.
And we had a good conversation with Joe before this meeting started today. Sometimes, so the governance committee, the governance team may be part of the cyberspace, right? But inside of your team, the CISOs group, but you might have representatives in the business on that same committee. And so we can holistically look at how what you're doing affects the company or how it rolls into their broader risk strategy.
Yep. So based on risk, we all have kind of our own definition of what that means. Low, medium, high, red, green, yellow, 7, 9, 12. It's just random numbers that we just kind of assign to stuff. We actually had a customer share a report with us, and he's like, hey, this is what our report was. And he goes, we're a 3.5. And we were like, is that a good thing? I don't understand what that means, and apparently the scale was 4. Okay. He goes, yeah, if we're at 3.5, we're really good. So when you go to communicate that up, and I'm sure that when he went to go talk to the agency director, and he said, hey, we're a 3.5, the agency director doesn't really care, right? It doesn't mean anything to them, so therefore it's hard for them to give something to them. Once you can put a quantitative number to it, and again, through the tabletop exercise, through the communication to the different risk holders, and you want to kind of bundle that, right? And one of the easiest ways to put a number behind, a risk is get hacked. You will learn very quickly when you go to report it to your insurance company or when you go to report it to the FBI, what your actual cost is. And it's also critical, like for instance, every FBI agent uses a different metric. So in Austin, it's a $50,000 loss, they'll get involved. In New York City, it's like $500,000, they'll get involved, right? Anything under that threshold, local offices decide that. So having that kind of stuff ready to go and understanding what those, risks and impacts to the business are can help you very quickly get, someone else involved. It can also push up the information to the people who accept the risk. As a CISO, we don't accept, it's not our job, right? We're not the risk holder. At the end of the day, it's not us. We are the vessel that gets communicated up. But the person who has fiduciary responsibility, who put handcuffs on if they screw up, that's not us.
And I think it's important too, so this example, I'll call it a 5-point risk scale, right? From low risk to extreme risk. And to Matt's point, we kind of define what each point on the scale means. And in the risk world, nirvana would be if you could do everything quantitatively. And that's what we're going for. But sometimes you just can't. Sometimes it's qualitative. But it's important if you're going to do a mixture of quantitative and qualitative to kind of describe it, right? And so if I'm medium risk, I want to say what it is. But where it gets tricky is, so in your area, you may use this 5-point scale. What you don't want to have happen is in the finance team have them using a 4-point scale or a 3-point scale, right? Or different risks. So it's important as an organization to have a common risk taxonomy, risk categories and structure you're applying to, and more importantly, you want to rate risk consistently the same way. Now, large organizations, that's not too bad. They'll have an enterprise risk management team that, in a sense, is going to own the risk taxonomy. They're going to own the methodology for rating risk and calculating it and how it aggregates together, which is great, right? They're going to work with the business, with the cyber and IT teams to figure that out. But in small organizations, you may not have that support. So you have to think about when you're communicating on your 5-point scale to management, does it align with whatever scale they're using? And and so you can actually bring your 3.5 and compare their 2.1, and actually be able to compare apples to apples. And so for larger companies, that's not a big deal, but small to medium-sized businesses, that's more challenging than it sounds, to actually rationalize risk and look at it holistically and commonly and measure it commonly across your organization.
And it's also, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
But it's also important to go to the financial side of it and make sure that their risk is the same as yours, because when you're going to ask for money later, they're the people who give it to you.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Well, would you want to put, like you have in the medium risk, the 5 to 50K number in there? Would you want to put numbers in all of them?
You would, yeah.
You do, absolutely. You
can.
want to put them wherever you can, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So when you define what a low risk is for your company, say I'm a Fortune 50 company, low risk for me might literally be anything less than $500 million. But if I'm a small company, that $500 million is catastrophic to me. That's extreme. Yeah. But you're right. You want to be consistent. So if I'm in finance or whatever part of the organization, you want to make sure you have the right numbers or the right rating for your low risk and your medium and your highs.
And again, when you go to do the financial aspect of it, the quantitative, it's important to go to the stakeholder that they're involved, right? Because if you assign a number to them, they're not going to like that number. If you ask them what the number is, and a lot of times when we've sit down to do that business impact analysis, we looked at they're like, I have no idea.
Yeah, we're kind of at your mercy, actually. We're going to ask you, what is the number to me? Yeah. And things like tabletop exercise and other scenarios will help me work with you to understand the number, but it definitely is a partnership to understand what that number is going to be for me.
Yeah. There's a great book called How to Measure Anything, and it's like, when you ask someone, how much does this cost? They say, I don't know. Well, is it $1 billion? No. Is it $100? No. Well, we have a range. Let's start narrowing that range down. The other example is a gumball thing.
Yeah, Matt has a great gumball math example I like.
I don't remember what it was on. It was on like Discovery Channel, and I watched it. It was brilliant. So if you want to figure out how many gumballs are in a gumball machine, or in one of the little vases, you basically ask 100 people how many gumballs you think are in there. And you do the average, and it's almost always right. When you do the average, that's the correct answer. So the more data inputs that you have, and over time, because year 1, numbers might be terrible. Year 5, the numbers are starting to get realistic, right? Because now you've done this exercise a few times, you've gotten more data inputs, and maybe some stuff has happened, and you can actually, figure out what that cost is. So it's important to kind of include them and also do it over time, not just one and done.
There's a trend when you like doing risk assessments in the financial space, at least it used to be annual risk assessment, then it was quarterly, sometimes it's monthly, and now it's automated if possible. That's actually ongoing or daily, right? So you get these data points more frequently, so they're more meaningful versus these kind of disparate points in time that are harder to draw trends from. Somebody has a question back there?
Yeah, I was going to add something. So money's always a factor, showing how to scale for the money part and what the impact is. But in software and AppSec, some other things that you can lean on that'll give you a similar thing is when you look at quality, you look at defects, you look at outages, right? You're always looking at what's the impact, right? Is it 100% of users can't use the application or the platform? Is it 1? Right?
Yeah.
And like you said, there's that scale. Okay, what does it mean? And you can narrow it down. And so when you can start to quantify how many people of our customer base is this going to impact, right? Or our partners, and then what does that look like? That'll help you kind of scale. And it's not quite full on quantitative as much as maybe money is, but it gives you a good approximation to tell you how impactful is this going to be to our operations, to our business. And now you're using language that your engineering teams, your software developers are already used to.
Yep, agreed.
Yeah, and I think that's important to understand is that by going to, for instance, AppSec, right, and to going to the different people and looking at what's important to them. So, for instance, if you go to the physical security department, right, they want to make sure nobody gets killed, nothing gets stolen, right? So that's their metrics, right? So everybody has their own metrics, but financial seems to work with financial people, and like you said, user count can be incredibly important. Do you do 5 nines or do you do, So this is, again, kind of talking about what we were talking about before, which, I've set up, risk dashboards, right, and all of my metrics. Those metrics are only valuable if they're valuable to other people, right? So I remember I set up a big dashboard and everybody was happy, and then the CEO came in and was like, what is this? You know, like it was just pretty dials. That doesn't mean shit to me.
I had a situation a year ago. We had a Big Four firm come in and develop 17 risk dashboards for us. They interviewed our team pretty quickly. He says, "Oh, we got it." Went off and came back, after 6 weeks with 17 risk dashboards, and they rolled out to our leadership team, and we looked at it, and literally we wanted one of them.
It's a win, I think.
Yeah, and it was about issues, and so it's important. Dashboards are great. We like them. The concept of dashboard is fantastic, right? You can see high information quickly. You can drill down if you want to, but it's still giving the right information that's meaningful. It's not helpful. Sometimes it's fun because you can just make a cool dashboard graphically. I've got some data, but it has to be data that's actually helpful and it demonstrates impact and helps them make decisions.
Yeah, because it should be, you can have a dashboard for you, but you also need to have a dashboard for others.
Sure. Another thing you think about is key risk indicators. And so you think about measuring risk. You can get it from you can measure it through risk assessments and other ways, but another common term is indicators, right? So this is something that might give you leading and lagging indicators. It might give you it lets you know risk might be happening, right? It's another form of data you can take into your risk assessment process, saying instead of 1 to 5, I can look at some metrics that say, okay, in my employee turnover risk might be increasing based on the trends. And so the example of this key risk indicator is an interesting one I read recently in CIO magazine. They talked about employee turnover, and they noticed organizations who had increased employee turnover were also having an increase in data loss. As the thought was, as employees are leaving the company, like a salesperson, for example, they're starting to take, customer information or whatever with them on their way out the door. And so a metric they were monitoring was employee turnover and how that affected data loss and how that affected their risk.
And some of those you can see in advance. So for instance, if you're getting ready to do a big layoff, then you got a bigger indicator. But working from home, I mean, that's one of those things that today we all understand it, right? But before COVID, it was crazy. We didn't see that coming, and when it came, there's now all of the stuff and all the information and all the data is now pushed out to your home. Kids are in there, who knows?
And so that's something you want to you can, if possible, turn into a metric, right? So percentage of my workforce working from home, or percentage of my workforce that has access to whatever data working from home, may be an indicator of potential risk in my organization. So that's something else to think about.
And also an indicator, is it good going forward? So everybody's trying to make that decision. Do we call people back to the offices? Well, if you don't know what data was lost, or if you don't know what risks were out there, you don't know whether it's better to have them work from home or work from here.
Or what to monitor.
Absolutely, right. What's important to look at, exactly.
Yep. So I'll let you take this one.
Yeah, we touched on this earlier, right? But instead of just showing up to somebody, and saying, "Hey, if you don't do this, you are, a bad person, or you're foolish, or whatever," right? It's good to go back to the impact, right? So if you don't do this, potential cost is X, or the impact is Y, right? That's a much better way to communicate to the business. Another thing that that's very helpful from the business perspective. I think, generally speaking, from anyone's perspective, look at outside sources as well. And so I know my prior organization, we used a product called Algo First, a data service. It would give us a monthly or weekly feed of incidents that happened across the U.S. Events and incidents, right? So it might be fraud incidents, financial crime, or cyber incidents, right? And so we, as a company, we were challenged to make sure we're monitoring those. Even though we're doing our own things that we think affect us, we also have to look to the outside and say, okay, what's happening in industry, or like-size organizations, what things are affecting them, what should we actually think about, what risks should we consider that we're not, and make sure we have programs in place to consider those. And in regards to a similar example, right?
Yeah, and recently I had a customer who was going through a breach, and the president was like, it's not a big deal, We found data that was needed to be reported to a federal agency, and they're like, no, it's okay. We don't believe it's the same data. And I was just floored. So I reached out to another client who had been through the same incident and said, hey, would you mind talking to them under anonymity or whatever? He said, I have no problem talking. So they ended up kind of communicating, and just having that experience from another person helped to kind of change the mindset.
And so having that access to outside confirmation or just information is very helpful. So in a sense, if you're trying to convince your chief risk officer about a potential risk in the cyberspace, and he's like, I don't get it. But if you can say, I've heard Deutsche Bank had the same problem, Citibank had the same problem, show concrete examples of how it affected them, then suddenly your CRO or whomever might think, or the CFO who's going to provide budget might think, oh, I guess we better think about it if it's happening to other organizations like us.
Yeah.
So that's a good way to provide substance for your argument or your request.
And then also, I remember doing a risk assessment and we looked at crime area, right? So if the crime in that area goes up, you have a better potential, if you're a physical security person, you have a better potential risk of something happening. So, kind of the key takeaways, they always say you hope for 4 points and people may walk around with 1, right? So the 4 points is speak the language. Most critically important is to speak the same language, have the same metrics, have the same conversations that they're doing, and do the math. So again, if you have a risk level, you need to kind of show them how that risk level came up, what was the calculation that got there. If you don't have the math, in grade school, they would give you an F, because you had to show the math to show you knew how to do the problem.
And then be inclusive, right? And Matt and I have talked about this before. So security should be like the neighborhood watch, right? Your whole organization should be part of security. So you want them to be involved, right? So create a culture of collaboration versus fear and scaring them away from working with you. I think that one recommendation I would have is make the business feel it's okay to basically report a false positive.
Yeah.
If they come to you with a problem that's not really a problem, don't belittle them or make them feel bad for reporting it. Say, thanks for coming to me and speaking to me, and explain to them. That way the next time they might find a real problem, they're still comfortable coming to you.
But so there's a great story of that just happened recently in Missouri. I don't know if you guys have read about that hack. So a reporter noticed on a Missouri website that if you right mouse clicked on the code, you could read the social security numbers of all the teachers. So the reporter reported it to the agency and said, hey, we're going to give you a few months to fix it, or a few weeks to fix it, and then we're going to run the story. Well, they fixed it kind of, but then when they ran the story, the governor is now filing charges against the reporter. That's nuts to me. First of all, HTML code's free. You're not hacking, it's like saying I broke into a park, you just walked in. So, but that's crazy to me, because as a state agency, who's going to report it? Google, Facebook, all those places are now like, hey, if you report stuff to us and we see it, we'll give you money, right? There's a reward program because it makes more sense to do it. And then metrics, not emotions, because a lot of times we can get frustrated. We can be like, why do you not see this? How are you so blind? We need money to fix this or else this is going to happen. But the reality is that's an emotion and not a metric, right? So we have to make sure that we understand, is this truly going to happen? We don't really control anything, right? I do say, though, I always use the example of I have a pre-sales team in China and Russia. I don't pay them. I don't know who they are, but they're busy, right? So, but to understand when they're going to attack, I have no idea. I can't make that up. So to understand the metrics of just the risk value is more important than actually getting the emotion of you have to do this. And then last but not least, be objective. It's really hard for us to know our strengths and to spot a blind spot, right? But if I'm a physical security person or if I came up from this technical background, I'm definitely going to lean more towards that, right? If most of my career was spent in this area, having outside counsel, and I say, go talk. So I have a buddy of mine who's FBI, and I go have lunch with him. I hear all kinds of trends from him, and I also, kind of run stuff by him. He's like, you're an idiot. Did you not think about? And I'm like, no.
Yeah, it's really helpful sometimes just to have an outside party, objective, come in and look what you're doing, and just proactively invite them in and say, here's my program, explain it to them, and get their thoughts, right? So you can kind of get ahead of your own blind spots before your management team does, or or something happens to you, right?
And embrace and accept weakness, right? Because I had one guy called me and said, hey, look, we'd like a penetration test or a vulnerability scan, and by the way, I passed all the other ones with perfect perfect scores. And I'm like, oh, so you want me to give you an A? That? How does that help? It's like going to the doctor and saying, how you feeling? Oh, I'm great, while you have cancer, right? It's just not helpful. He's not going to be able to help you. So being able to actually go out and tell the truth and work with it. And again, committees can help. So bringing those organizations, those stakeholders in, that's who you're trying to protect, right? The stakeholders' data, the stakeholders, whatever it is, who those people are is who you're trying to protect. So bring them in on that conversation. See if they have concerns. I'm doing a presentation in San Antonio in December, and what we're doing is we're sending out a survey so that we know what the risks are, and then that way the conversation will be about what they are afraid of, not what I think they're afraid of.
Yeah, I think it's a great example. We have a client who had an incident recently, and they didn't include the rest of the business. So they had a technical person spot the problem, the CISO and them work together to solve it, but they didn't talk to the actual risk holder before they did it, right? So something that the CISO and his team thought, well, something we took care of, actually was a pretty significant risk to the business holder in their eyes. And so talk to them about it, right? You're responding to an incident that affects someone else. Have them on the team, right? Have them help you understand what the actual risk is beyond just a technical solution.
Yeah. And with that, any questions?
Sure.
I was curious. I think these strategies are great. I've used some of them before, presenting to management, trying to get budget and things like that. One thing I've been asked for and never had a good answer was like indexing against similar companies, right? Like, oh, how many entities should we have? How much budget should we have? Do you guys have any resources that you use for that sort of thing?
There are some resources out there. I've been seeing it more and more, and that's why also InfraGard is a good organization to join. I guess it's mainly focused on critical infrastructure, but they pretty much will let anybody in. I mean, they'll let me in, but it's one of those things that it's important to kind of have that safe area that you can talk. The other thing is talk to CISO groups, right? So, and you can talk to them about budget and keep it anonymous, but at least you're right. You do get metrics and markers, because some people spend a lot of money and some people spend a little bit of money. And to me, I think that's your next business, is start building those metrics, because knowing, this company spent $20,000 and got breached 5 times versus a company that spent $150,000 and got breached once, that would be a very valuable, important metric.
Yeah, it's kind of challenging, right? Because I think in other parts of the business, like in the financial space or whatever, it's pretty common for like-sized organizations to get together and share thoughts, right? Have working groups, and they can share information. They're competitors, but they kind of work together. Yeah. But in the cyberspace, you don't really want to share a lot as much, right? It's a little more private, so it's harder to find those similar companies that want to sit down and have that conversation with you. It's a little bit more challenging. So it is helpful to look outside. We use the example of InfraGard, and I use the example of Algo First. You can see a report, sometimes anonymous, sometimes actually company's information around the reports, the actual loss, and what the cost was to them. And so that's there. But I think to Matt's point, if you can solve that problem, you'll have a great business model.
A business right there, because it is an important metric, you're right. Yes, sir.
When you mentioned business impact assessments, is that more of an expanded view of like what a business impact analysis is, where you identify your core business functions, RTOs, RPOs, that sort of thing?
Yep.
Is that part of that overall process, but it's more expanded, or
Yeah.
similar? Or?
Yeah.
Go
In the business continuity space, right? So most businesses have all their processes documented from A to B. I do accounting. They do all the things I do as a business. I have a process documented for them, and each one of those processes, if it's done right, should have a business impact assessment associated with it, right? So I have a BIA for my particular process. I'm a process owner in accounting. I charge the accounting process. I know what my BIA is, and so if something happens to me, I should have that assessment, done periodically, so I can communicate that risk and know what it is. And so I think it is a broader term, right? It should be happening across the organization.
And the financial people are a really good asset and resource, because they have been doing, since the dawn of time, right? Since money has been invented, people are like, I don't trust your money. I'm going to get a second, third. They have been doing third-party evaluations. They have separation of duties. They've been doing all this stuff since day one, and they have a lot of experience to tracking every single dollar. Utilizing and leveraging that experience and bringing them into the risk organization, and maybe even including them in a risk assessment, right? Because they go through SOC 2, they go through all their financial audits on a regular basis. They're used to audits. When you hit some of these other organizations and other stakeholders, they don't like audits. They're like, why are you asking me about how much this process is and what this entails? So utilizing and leveraging that internal talent that you have at the organization can be important.
Any other questions?
No? All right. Well, thanks.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.
Appreciate it.